Hi, my name is Seoidin and I'm a socially engaged artist. I work within the sort of fields of critical ecology. I've been working in this field for about 15 years and have developed a number of projects over those years. The way I'd define social practice is practices that work outside the studio maybe and outside the gallery. So that means working with communities, working with histories of place, working with potentially archaeologies of place, but really working like out in the world and working and thinking critically with communities. And for me, it's also ecologies at the moment at a time of climate crisis. I actually don't mind being called a community-based artist. It feels like community has been taken out a little bit of ideas of social practice, but the history of the practice evolved in kind of quite sort of political, critical ways of thinking and working with community groups or working with people that maybe didn't access galleries and stuff. So I think it's something we potentially need to reclaim. So I grew up in Zambia and then lived in Durban, South Africa. I'm now living in Dublin in Ireland. And during my fine art degree, which was I studied in Technikon Natal in Durban, South Africa. I suppose like all art students, I started with drawing, painting, sculpture, and then in my third year, it was a 4-year degree, I read a book by Susie Gamblick, and it was Conversations Before the End of Time. And the other artist that I really started to think and look at was Joseph Beuys. And both these artists reflected the concerns I kind of saw out on the street, or, you know, I was living in a post-apartheid South Africa, but had also lived through apartheid. So I had kind of seen the injustices. And I was also volunteering at the time in a township nearby with an arts organisation called Artworks Trust, who were working in schools in black communities, but schools where children had no access to art. So I think bringing these practices of Susie Gamblick, Joseph Beuys, and then a community arts organisation, Artworks Trust, working with children and teenage adults who didn't have access to arts informed my kind of future practice. When I moved to Ireland, which was in 2000, I'd finished my degree in fine art in Durban, and I was looking for what I might do as a path to further study. And I looked for social practice art MAs, but there was none. So the kind of landscape of third level education has really changed and evolved in kind of the last 20 years in Ireland. So what I ended up doing was I did development studies course. So this is a course that people who work with NGOs will study in order to work with people on the ground and communities in mostly Africa, you know, through Troker and stuff like that. What was interesting for me is that it was a really kind of critical form of education, because the education takes the positioning of the global south and reflects on spaces of injustice across economy, across environment, and this kind of fed into kind of for me a kind of critical thinking. So I was attracted during that year of study at looking at what's called critical pedagogies. So this is community-based pedagogies where you speak to kind of ideas of empowerment. So you go in as a teacher, an activist, an artist, and work with community to find out what their needs are. And through working with their needs in some way, ideas of projects and that are activated. So, and then the second area of study within that course was around looking at ideas of sustainability, but within a sort of post-development framework where you're looking at ideas of monocultural farming and industrial farming that were imported on communities in Africa, but also spaces like India, which were really damaging ecologically to communities, to people who were maybe based or whose livelihood worked so closely with the land. So this started to kind of frame this kind of critical ecological land practice and thinking for me. To start with, you obviously need a kernel of idea, but you also need collaborators. So it's important to do research into who you're going to work with and negotiate and talk to those people. And once you have set up those relationships, whether it's a community group, an arts organization, a university, researcher, dancer, whoever it be, you then look for pockets of funding. So loads of councils have funding for community events and then also for the arts. And they're often like between 500 to 2,000, 3,000 euro. And they're really good starting points for projects where you can kind of do this development phase of the project where you're researching and connecting with partners and working. So look for those pockets of funding first. And then once you have done that sort of 3-4 month period of research, if you get the award, you don't always get the funding, then you can then go on to look for other sources of funding. So for me, a project like Hard Graft, we started with initial funding from the Citizen Artist Award, but then we realized that we needed further funding, so it was a KBC Bank 500 euro award. And then once my practice had developed and I had documentation, I was able to apply for Next Generation Artist Bursary Award. So I developed relationships with community groups. I developed critical thinking on what the practice was, what the practice was doing. I had evidence of having started the practice through photo documentation, and then letters of support are always really important. So when you're doing funding applications, make sure that your partners write in reference letters for you. The more reference letters you can get to support the application, what the funders want to see is that this project is going to be realized and can be realized. And then you just build from there. So then after that, and kind of 2 years of work, UCD Geography approached myself and Common Ground for an Environmental Protection Agency project award, which evolved into Mapping Green Dublin. So, the kind of projects build. Sometimes there might be a call out for funding for a project, and I'll read what the remit is and think with it a little bit and think, is there anything I'm interested in exploring within that neighborhood or within that community, or is there anything that I'm already thinking about within my practice which might be around seed saving, community gardens. More recently it was grafting of trees that would work within that sense. So there's always a space of research beforehand to just see if there's anything that makes sense, and then I kind of do the work in putting forward a proposal. So that's one way I approach. But the other way I approach is I have a kernel of idea and there's an area of research I want to think about, or there's someone I want to work with who is doing and working in that area. So for example, UCD Geography recently, I saw that they'd mapped Dublin's tree canopy and I wanted to link in with them. So I just organized to meet them and speak with them. And then they approached me around an Environmental Protection Agency project, and we have just completed the Mapping Green Dublin project, where we worked with community mapping of green spaces within the neighbourhoods of Dublin 8. So, you know, it's different projects lead onto other projects, but it can vary, like in terms of approach. It's building relationships throughout, and then just keeping up with your practice to just make sure that you as an artist, that your work is still sort of centralized within, you know, what is happening and not co-opted by potentially, you know, partners. You've got to always try and hold on to your space as you kind of go through the process, but also I think it's really important to connect back. So creating and developing check-in meetings throughout the project, and also just writing to what the project aims are and kind of going back and checking them. They can change, but it's important that it's so easy to just go off track of what the project is actually meant to be doing or what you'd set out to do. I suppose I always had the idea that I potentially would go back to South Africa and potentially work with artists in South Africa, activists in South Africa. But what started to happen is there was a really incredible activist movement that kind of was developing around ideas of reclaim the streets and the the Iraq War. And I started to attend protests, but also there was this grassroots gathering where we were looking at ideas of community gardens, but also the ideas of food sovereignty. So why is it important to grow your own food? And then you start learning about the importance of heritage and heirloom seeds for communities. But then you start to think, well, what is this critical kind of land practice in Ireland? And then you start to kind of go, oh wow, we were colonized. Oh yeah, we're a post-colony, and we're the least forested country in the whole of Europe, and you just realize that actually there's so much that needs to be unpacked here. So a lot of my practices just started to kind of think here, and a lot of artists work with like ideas of the bogs, ideas of Ireland's energy kind of footprint, you know, through carbon and data centres. You know, there's so much work that needs to be done here around pollution and climate, and thinking how to heal our environment and ecologies. So in kind of working with communities, I'll just maybe start with the Hog Graft project. Something we wanted to do, like within the project, was to bring a skill kind of back to community. So this idea of grafting, and through the development of 2 community gardens within Dublin 8 area, the Dublin's Men's Shed, and I think because of the Celtic Tiger downturn, Dublin City Council had given over land to community gardens. So there's this whole skill that kind of had been developed in the area of food growing, and people who hadn't necessarily worked with land because they had been disenfranchised from land, and you know, they were living in social housing, had never gardened before but now had started gardening. We're thinking about seeds and seed saving, so bringing that grafting practice, very practical, as a skill and a tool that they can take and use wherever, was kind of part of the start of the project. And then the call out just went to a wider community. So people in the sort of biodiversity groups in the area, environmental groups in the area came along and learnt how to graft trees through this expert grafter from UCD, Rosemount Research Station, Kevin Kenny. So, you know, it's just very practical. It's like we're grafting trees, but then when we start grafting trees, we start to talk about the fact that there's only 3 types of apple tree that are sold in garden centres, and Irish seed savers save the heritage trees around Ireland so that future heritage of DNA is saved for potential climate change in the future. So it's kind of this heritage bank of that we deserve to kind of have access to and save for future generations. But it's simply, we're just cutting branches and, you know, starting with just creating these sapling trees and then putting them in the ground. Then the second stage of that work moves into, okay, we have these 60 grafted trees that we've collectively grafted, and they're in 2 beds in the community gardens, but now we need to find land and sites for orchards. So then it involves conversations with groups of, is there any public space where we can plant these orchards? So then it becomes about growing food on public land. And what happened with the project is community groups take ownership of those trees and of that site, and then they become the stewardship, you know, the stewards of those trees and that kind of site. So there is a sustainability that kind of comes into it. And then potentially in the future, people will be able to pick fruit and, who knows, maybe feast on it. But I mean, it's very idealized, but it's the learning along the way is just as important. You know, it's the process. The reason I speak to kind of critical ecologies instead of ideas of sustainability is in recent years, with the awareness of climate change, is there is a lot of greenwashing that kind of happens, and sustainability is a kind of difficult word that's been co-opted a lot by you know, government, but it's not about kind of critical change in any way. It's still kind of business as usual and carry on in terms of the economy comes first. So I started to think about ideas of sustainment, or the ideas of how do you sustain your practice as an artist. I think we kind of need to think to that, but also ideas of sustenance. How do you kind of feed and nurture yourself and keep yourself well, because there's so much like artist burnout, activist burnout. It's really kind of precarious industry. We're here because we love you know, creativity, we love making, there's a real generosity in arts practice, but then there's also real generosity in activist practice and community. So we kind of need to take care of each other. So, you know, it's that kind of ideas of thinking critically with critical care and sustainment. I think with projects, it's really important to be able to eventually like step away, and you've got to step away carefully, you know. So either create closure on a project, so through some kind of ending, some kind of celebration, a kind of closing of the circle, you know, bring that project to an end in some way, or create a kind of a legacy or a handover in some way to, you know, the next group. And then I think the difficulty for a lot of artists is you might look back at what's going on in that space and it's not quite how you had devised it, but it's important to just realize it's not yours anymore. You know, so it's that acceptance. I think for me as an artist, it's always important to exit, because often in these neighborhoods, I'm not of that neighborhood, you know, I don't live in that area. So the long-term aspect is to ensure that there is sustainability built into the project, so that there's trust and that kind of space of care, but also you know, people taking ownership of the work. But what often happens with projects is that project leads into another project or another idea. So for example, that hard graph became Mapping Green Dublin. And I've just finished that Mapping Green Dublin project. So in my head, I've put a line on it, but there are call outs now for wider funding on climate, that I know that I could go back to Mapping Green Dublin and potentially link it to, another project or area to carry on. So, one project does lead into the other project. They kind of, it just feeds a practice in a way. I think it's really important also as an artist to make sure that you are leaving kind of equipped with a toolkit in a way that you can further develop your practice. So throughout your practice, to think about making sure that you include funding for documentation in some way, and documentation in social practice is really important. So a lot of us use publications as a form of dissemination because we don't necessarily show our work in the galleries. You have to think about alternative forms of holding projects. Video is always really good, either that through film or documentary, photography, but also websites. Just holding the project and organizing the project so it's visible and archived through these means, I think, is something I'd encourage young artists to think to and do. And it is really incredibly important for future funding, because then it shows the funder or the people looking at the panel what the legacy of your practice is, and that will encourage them to fund further projects, because it's that idea that, again, that they can see, oh, actually this person knows how to create a project, this person has created a project and will be able to create a future project. It's that. Maybe another bit of advice I'd give for social practice artists is to make sure you have a peer group. Social practice work can be really isolating, and it's kind of the irony in the work, because we're often on our own as artists working in community, and we very rarely have opportunities to speak to other artists because we're not going to art openings. We do attend art openings, but it's not like that is our way to network. So establish reading groups so that you and fellow artists are thinking about ideas within your work and practice, just make sure that you have that kind of peer group that can kind of support you through, so when you run into kind of crisis that you can have somewhere to go.